In the early days of Hollywood, one of the hottest celebrity hangouts was, in fact, several hours away from Hollywood. Nestled along the central California coast outside a village called San Simeon sits the historic estate called La Cuesta Encantada, better known today as Hearst Castle. These days, it's a tourist attraction for people who can't get into Disneyland, but the property has a much stranger history than your average old home. So, today, we're exploring the golden age of Hearst Castle, Hollywood's original party pad. But first, make sure you've subscribed to the Weird History channel. After that, drop down to the comments and let us know what other castles you want to hear about. All right, let's Xanadu this. Wealthy publisher William Randolph Hearst is perhaps best remembered today as the basis for Orson Welles' classic film Citizen Kane. Like the movie character he inspired, Hearst owed his family fortune to a lucrative series of gold mines, but opted to pursue his own career in the publishing business. In 1887, he took over control of newspaper The San Francisco Examiner, which his father had acquired as payment for a gambling debt. Though he fostered a reputation as a populist who defended the working man against corrupt institutions, Hearst wasn't against using the paper to advance his own financial interests, which his many critics called a textbook definition of yellow journalism. Perhaps Hearst's most infamous journalistic accomplishment was helping push the U.S. into the Spanish-American War by provoking outrage against Spain, particularly after the 1898 sinking of the USS Maine. To this day, the specific causes of the Maine disaster remain unknown, but that didn't stop Hearst's paper from blaming the Spanish government, using the disaster as a rallying cry and a pretense to sell more newspapers. Sure, he may have sparked a few international conflicts here and there, but Hearst's editorial strategy was objectively successful. By the 1920s, he owned a nationwide string of around 28 newspapers, including the Los Angeles Examiner, the Boston American, the Detroit Times, and the Washington Herald. He also started publishing magazines, many of which remain in circulation today, like Cosmopolitan and Good Housekeeping. Hearst's empire reached its peak just ahead of the Great Depression, which collapsed his revenue streams and made his paper's conservative outlook increasingly unpopular. Long before his empire started to collapse, Hearst's decision to buy a grand property in Central California was, in various ways, inspired by his parents. He was introduced to the trailblazing architect Julia Morgan by his mother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, an important patron of the arts. Morgan was an undeniably impressive individual, the first woman to study architecture at the elite school of Beaux-Arts in Paris, and the first woman to maintain an independent architectural business in the state of California. Reportedly, she also had a mean hookshot. Hearst was a fan of Morgan's work, but it's also worth pointing out that he had some ulterior motives in hiring her for this large and imposing job. He famously boasted that, because many other wealthy men at the time were unwilling to hire a female architect, her services were available at a significant discount. Hopefully he was a big tipper. In 1919, William Randolph Hearst inherited $11 million, along with a collection of properties and estates, from his father, businessman George Hearst. Originally, William reached out to Morgan about building a comfortable private home on the San Simeon coast, where he sometimes enjoyed camping out. But his vision for the property massively expanded over time, thanks in large part to this influx of cash and assets. By 1925, his San Simeon property grew to around 250,000 acres, the perfect size for a modest, relaxing camping trip. In all, Hearst and Morgan worked on the project for 28 years, modeling the exterior on Spanish buildings Hearst had admired during trips to the country. These trips to Spain also inspired the home's formal name, La Cuesta Encantada, which translates to the Enchanted Hill, suggesting that in addition to all that money, Hearst also had a wizard. Because of Hearst's endless imagination and the financial crisis that hit his companies in the 1930s, the full vision of Hearst Castle was never completely realized. Even with over 500 individual structures on the estate, the man basically had an entire zip code to himself. Alone, the main house on the property, known as Casa Grande, contains over 100 rooms. Collectively, including guest houses and additional buildings, the full property boasts 42 bedrooms, 61 bathrooms, and 19 sitting rooms, along with indoor and outdoor swimming pools, a movie theater, bridges, an airfield, tennis courts, and what was once the world's largest privately owned zoo. Today, only a few animals remain in San Simeon, but during Hearst's lifetime, the estate was filled with all manner of exotic creatures, including kangaroos, camels, yaks, ostriches, jaguars, lions, elephants, tapirs, tigers, monkeys, and several species of bear. Oh my! Due to the vagaries of Hearst's record-keeping, it's impossible to accurately calculate how much he spent on building and maintaining the property during these years. But some estimates suggest that between 1919 and 1947, Hearst spent somewhere around $10 million on the castle. But of course, that was just for the buildings. Hearst was also acquiring art and antiquities from around the world to display in his castle home, which he wanted to serve as a personal museum, as well as a McDuckian residence. Many of these pieces remain on display in the castle to this day. But the collection was so vast, much of it has been divided up between museums and collectors across the world over time. Hearst also purchased the entire monastery of St. Bernard de Clairvaux in Sacramania, Spain, and had his workers dismantle it, stone by stone, for transport back to the U.S. This was, of course, an impractical and even dangerous task. At one point, Hearst's workers were reportedly attacked by enraged villagers. Unfortunately, soon after the shipment arrived in New York, Hearst's financial woes started and prevented him from ever completing the reassembly. The stones remained in crates in a Brooklyn warehouse for 26 years, until they were purchased in 1952 after Hearst's death. Hearst, his vaudeville performer wife Millicent, and their children moved into Casa Grande around Christmas in 1925 and stayed there just 1 year, when Hearst's infidelity caused their marriage to fall apart. The couple never formally divorced, but Millicent left the property and embarked on a new life in New York as a socialite and philanthropist. Hearst's mistress, actor Marion Davies, moved in soon after and became the woman of the house in all but name. We assume she kept a toothbrush in all 61 bathrooms. It was in this era, from 1926 through the 1930s, that the castle became a popular getaway for both the Washington and Hollywood elite. Stars and notables who passed through the doors include Cary Grant, Greta Garbo, Jimmy Stewart, Bob Hope, Joan Crawford, Charlie Chaplin, U.S. Presidents Calvin Coolidge and Franklin D. Roosevelt, and UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill. One night, iconic comedy performer Harpo Marx found a large stash of mink coats in the basement vault, then ran around the property placing them on all the statues in the garden as a prank, which is the sort of thing you should expect when you invite a Marx brother. One of the major attractions that made the long trip from LA to San Simeon so popular was Hearst's access to free-flowing alcohol. Though prohibition was the law of the land starting in 1920, Hearst kept a massive wine cellar on the property with room for an estimated 10,000 bottles. Though he encouraged guests to enjoy themselves, he also cut off anyone he felt was overindulging in his private stash. Hearst famously denied a drink to the legendary author/boozehound Dorothy Parker, and Pig Panther star David Niven is reported to have stashed liquor bottles around the house to avoid the old man's disapproval. As a result, Easter egg hunts at the castle were closely monitored. The wealthiest and most privileged guest also had the option to fly in, if the drive or train ride seemed overly cumbersome. Hearst's private airstrip was outfitted with 2 runways, in opposite orientations, to allow takeoffs and landings in all kinds of weather. He even had his own 8-passenger plane, which was often used to ferry in and out VIPs. Floodlights installed around the property made it visible from the air, and helpfully added to the lavish vibes. These airstrips weren't exclusively used for transporting guests. Hearst also had pilots fly around the country, purchasing his newspapers and delivering them back to him each day, so he could keep an eye on his empire. Imagine the jet fuel they could have saved if he had just used a smartphone. The property boasted a 130-square-mile ranch, which Hearst kept at least partly in operation. Guests at the castle had the option of riding horses around the expansive acreage and would even camp out under the stars on particularly pleasant nights. Hearst sometimes set up overnight trips into the relative wilderness of the ranch, taking pack mules along to bring sleeping bags, cooking utensils, and champagne and caviar, all the traditional hallmarks of roughing it. One anecdote reports that Hearst once used the mules to transport an entire hillbilly band up the mountain for a command performance. Hopefully he gave them drink tickets. Invitations to the castle were considered a badge of honor, a sign that you'd made it within the high-class circles. To make attendance even more exclusive, Hearst would only invite notable people once. If they turned him down, as Katharine Hepburn once did and later regretted, that was it. They were excluded for life. Hearst also famously assigned everyone seats for dinner, placing his favorite guests of the moment closer to him at the table. It was said that a guest could tell their time at the castle was running out when they were seated far away from their host. It's the kind of behavior people only tolerate from the extremely rich. When the castle was particularly lively and full of guests, Hearst would sometimes throw elaborate costume parties at the 110-room beach house he'd constructed specifically for Davies. This included an infamous circus-themed 1938 celebration commemorating the publisher's 75th birthday, for which Bette Davis, one of the most famous actresses of the day, dressed as a bearded lady and mingled, often unnoticed, among 2,000 invited guests. An entire wall was torn down to accommodate a full-sized merry-go-round. Hearst apparently had the wall rebuilt following the gala, but he might have kept the carousel. Though Citizen Kane alludes to the grandeur of the castle, which the film retitles Xanadu, it doesn't fully do justice to the massive scale of the property and the voluminous treasures and amenities Hearst kept therein. The publisher was deeply offended by the film, and though he couldn't legally keep it off the movie screens and was unable to convince MGM co-founder Louis B. Mayer of outright purchasing it for him to destroy, he used his full public power to keep audiences away. Hearst's papers declined to publicize the film at all, and gossip columnist Luella Parsons joined the campaign to limit its visibility. Essentially, he used all his considerable media influence to dump on the film. By the late 1930s, Hearst found himself deeply in debt, forcing him to cede control of his company and sell off not just his many newspapers and magazines, but his art collections. This marked the end of his castle's heyday as a spot for entertaining, and by the start of World War II, he and Davies had largely abandoned the property. Hearst made his final visit to San Simeon in 1947, before moving to Beverly Hills until his death in 1951, and Rosebud was nowhere in sight. So what do you think? Want to make a trip to the Hearst Castle? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.